Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. In North Carolina, students with disabilities are falling behind. Test scores show that they're not doing as well as their peers nationally, and they're suspended at far higher rates than other students. Advocates want more resources, more training, and better curriculum. WRAL Education Insider Emily Walkenhorst is here to explain what it'll take to improve. Emily, welcome.
Good to be here.
You recently wrote a deeply reported article laying out the status of education for students with disabilities. Give us a quick rundown of where things stand for them.
So right now, students with disabilities are testing worse year after year. For several years now, especially in math, we've seen declining test scores, especially in comparison to their peers nationally. There's also data that shows students with disabilities are suspended at far higher rates than other students. And the reality may actually be worse, because we talked to some people who talked about more unofficial suspensions happening for their children. So that's where we are today.
So what do the test scores show? Why are they so low, and what are teachers telling you?
So the test scores show, especially in math, that scores have really been declining for students with disabilities over the years. And in reading, the decline has been a little bit more recent, but it's still there, and it's dipping below the achievement level of students nationally as well. And some of the thoughts, especially on reading, are that, maybe students with dyslexia aren't getting proper curriculum. And so that's what we're seeing.
So what are education experts telling you about this?
So there are a lot of different things that people are saying, both education experts and parents, that maybe curriculum isn't appropriate, as I mentioned before, for students with dyslexia. We're also hearing that, maybe there aren't enough resources for students with disabilities. There are a lot of people who just want more adults in the classroom who are trained and prepared to work with students with disabilities. Right now, caseloads seem to be a little bit too high for certain special education teachers. And so, a lot of people want to see more resources, more personnel, just more money in the system for those things.
So how is the state going to remedy this?
So the state is looking at increasing or at least changing its funding for students with disabilities that could result in an increase in funding. Essentially what the Department of Public Instruction is currently doing is they are creating a model for funding that would base how much money students receive on the severity level of their disability. So different disabilities would be classified by different severities, and different students might be put in a different severity level, and then you would get more money if it's more severe. But they haven't finished that model. They actually started doing a model several years ago and stopped, and now they're working on one again at the request of lawmakers. But, this idea of changing the model really isn't new. The state really hasn't made any changes despite recommendations over the last several years.
Your reporting was framed in the context of the Leandro lawsuit. That's the long-running education adequacy lawsuit. Tell us about the lawsuit. How does education for students with disabilities figure into that plan?
So the lawsuit features what's called a comprehensive remedial plan, which is something the parties agreed to. So that's the state and the school boards and families that sued, saying their children weren't getting an adequate education. They agreed to this plan, and part of that plan says we need to increase funding for students with disabilities to 2.3 times the amount that students, the average student receives. And so that's what the plan calls for. But that the current system the funding is much less than that, and it's actually capped at 13% of a district's student population. So if 14% of your students have a disability, the state will only fund up to 13% of those students, which means the per dollar amount has to stretch a little bit further in those schools. And most school systems identify more than 13% of their students with a disability.
Emily, what kinds of disabilities are we talking about when we talk about students with disabilities? I would imagine it's a pretty broad range.
It is. So to be in special education officially, you have to have a disability that shows to be negatively impacting your academic experience at school. And they have 13 or so categories for that. Autism spectrum disorder, intellectual disability, hearing impairment, visual impairment. There's even a mental and behavioral health category, speech language. I mean, there are several different types of disabilities. So if you have dyslexia, you would be eligible if, it was harming your academic performance. So it's most any type of disability that could, in theory, impact your academics.
Can you give us a sense of where education offerings for students with disabilities are today in North Carolina versus where they were, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago?
So there is more funding for students with disabilities than there used to be. So adjusted for inflation, it's about $1,000 more per student than it was 30 years ago. So there is some more money. A lot of that is just going up with the cost of salaries and benefits, especially benefits for teachers. So that's part of the increase, but it's still below what some advocates really want.
Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll hear about what families are going through as they navigate services for disabled students. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL Education Insider Emily Walkenhorst about why North Carolina's disabled students are falling behind. Emily, you spoke with a number of families trying to get the services they need for their disabled students. What did they tell you?
They told me a variety of things. Specifically, I really spoke in depth to the mothers of 2 children with autism spectrum disorder and some related disabilities. And, essentially what they really wanted was just more assistance for their children. So a lot of that included more training on how to work with children who have autism spectrum disorder. And also, more one-on-one aids, people to help them in bigger classroom environments, or just give them reminders on some of the therapies that they work through. Things like, students with autism, they might do a lot of therapies that help them with their executive functioning, and an aid can remind them of some of those tools and tricks to help them be more productive and engaged in a classroom setting.
You spoke with one parent named Susan Book and also her son. Can you describe kind of what they're going through just to sort of illustrate the challenges that some parents face?
Susan's son, Emerson, has autism spectrum disorder, and he also has dysgraphia, which is kind of a writing disability. And so he was diagnosed at a fairly young age, and he's been in special education pretty much his entire school experience. But she had to go back and forth. He ended up attending 3 different elementary schools in Wake County that Susan described as being very different from one another. Different in terms of, maybe this school didn't have the resources that another school had, but that other school didn't have educators with quite as much training on how to work with students with autism. And then the third school that her son went to really had more resources. They have a private foundation that raises hundreds of thousands of dollars every year and that funds more staff at schools. And so he had a little bit more attention at that school, which, she believed he really needed because he can get overwhelmed in a classroom setting. And so having somebody who's more available to help him really made a big difference, because he missed a lot of school before he reached that point because he'd get stressed out. He might have a meltdown in a classroom. Maybe, staff tried to restrain him or didn't respond in the way that he needed. And so he would end up wanting to go home, and the school just thought, it wasn't working out for him today. And so she'd have to pick him up from school a lot, which resulted in a lot of missed class time. So Emerson's in middle school now, and he's doing a lot better now that he has a one-on-one aide. He's had a little bit more attention and specialized therapies as he's gotten older, and it's really helped settle him quite a bit more. So they're actually very happy once they actually got a lot more resources, it's made a big difference.
I would imagine that this is also really frustrating for teachers. You've reported about teacher shortages throughout the state. What did they have to tell you?
So teachers very commonly are concerned about caseloads. You can see this just in any kind of forum online or, other venues where, teachers who work with special education, they're called exceptional children's teachers. They often feel that their caseloads are way too big. They're working with dozens of students, and they really think the ideal is maybe closer to 15 to 20 students. And so they're overwhelmed with paperwork. But then, I also spoke with teachers who worked in classrooms that were only for special education students. And they described a wide variety of needs and, places where the kids were academically just in a classroom of even just 12 students. They described maybe not having all the resources they wanted for some of the students. They had to spend a lot of money on different tools, things that the kids could work with physically to help them do any number of things, task management or, organizing their routines. And, there was even one teacher who described wanting to buy socks of a different color so that students could learn their colors by being able to sort socks. And, she had to buy those, and they had to buy color printers and things like that. And so, feeling like they didn't have the resources they needed was very stressful. And actually, two of the teachers I spoke with have quit already, even though they both told me it was their dream job. They quit after only about 3 years.
So if public schools can't offer all the services that students with disabilities need, are there alternatives?
So one of the first things a public school will do if a student needs, let's say, speech language therapy and they don't have anyone on staff to provide it, is they go out and seek contracts. And that can be really successful in some schools. They just do a contract with an agency that has somebody who can do that service. But some schools really struggle to find anybody, or there's turnover. And so students were supposed to get speech language therapies, but they weren't able to. And so maybe students had to come in the summer to get those therapies instead that they couldn't get during the school year. For families, they could look for another school that might specialize in certain things. A lot of charter schools and private schools don't specialize, but some of them do. If you could get your child into one of those and you could afford to pay for a private school, that is in theory an option. But, the tuition at those schools could be tens of thousands of dollars. And, some parents have said, well, my child could never get accepted into one of those schools because they've had behavioral problems at their previous school. But, I've also talked to parents who spent thousands and tens of thousands or even over $100,000 on either private tutoring for their children or private schooling for their children because they were ultimately just looking for a school that had lower class size, or they had or a school that had the type of curriculum they were really looking for. Now, if a student is enrolled in special education, the public school is supposed to pay for any outside services that a student needs. So one parent did send her child to a private school that only serves about 60 students a year. It's a very, very small school. They don't have a lot of openings for students. And the public school paid for her son to go there because they couldn't provide him with what he needed at the public school. And so that's in theory an option, but there are a lot of financial obstacles and also just a finite number of seats out there just for students who need those things. And what it comes down to is, a lot of the things happening in the public school to begin with.
So what's the state going to do about all this? What's next?
So the state is once again looking at revising its funding formula to increase services for students with more severe disabilities. But we don't necessarily know what that's going to look like. They're working on it right now. And we might see a proposal suggested to lawmakers and maybe even a bill filed as soon as this spring on it. But in the past, people have made suggestions to change special education funding, and it didn't necessarily go anywhere. So, we'll just kind of see what this proposal is and how receptive lawmakers are to it.
Well, I'm sure you'll keep us posted. Emily, thank you for your reporting on this. That's WRAL Education Insider Emily Walkenhorst. For her deep dive into education for students with disabilities, visit the education section of WRAL.com. I'm Jack Hagel. Thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.